Warwick, and Richard was his family came to prominence in their efforts in the war against the Scots, and King Richard II granted his Richard of Warwick that we're discussing, the earldom of Westmoreland, and Richard's father also inherited through marriage the earldom of Salisbury from the Montague family. Richard, we don't know very much about his early life. We know that in 1436, at age 8, he was married to Anne Beauchamp, who was daughter of Richard Beauchamp, who was the Earl of Warwick, and his wife was Isabel de Spencer. This meant that in the future he would inherit the earldoms of Salisbury and Warwick, as well as he would inherit the inheritance. He would get the inheritances of de Spencer, Montague, and Beauchamp as well. And this also led to a battle between families over the inheritance between the Duke of Somerset, who had married into the Beauchamp family, as well as the family, Richard's family. Richard, most of his life, his family was very loyal to the king. They were very loyal to Henry VI. And by 1445, Richard had become a knight. More than likely, he was knighted at the coronation of Margaret of Anjou when she married Henry. And he served Henry VI against the Scots, as well as against his first cousin, Richard, Duke of York, or against his first cousin, who was Richard, Duke of York, when he rose up against the king in 1452 over his dispute with Somerset, with the Duke of Somerset. However, a year later, Henry VI had become mentally incompetent by this point, and Margaret of Anjou had begun running the country. As you can see on the left, that's Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou, who was queen. And the Duke of Somerset was, in the summer of 1453, was granted lordship of Glamorgan, which was disputed by Richard Warwick, and this upset both Richard and his cousin, the Duke of York, and and after a military defeat in France in 1454, Warwick, the nobles turned on Somerset, and this led to, in the future, York becoming the protector of England due to his stability compared to Somerset. However, this was a short protectorate for York, and Somerset regained further power, which upset York and Warwick further, thinking about the favoritism that he was being granted. In 1455, Warwick was the general of York-led forces to meet with Henry at St. Albans, the First Battle of St. Albans, which resulted in the death of Somerset as well as the capture of the King Henry at the time. And this led to a second protectorate for York. Margaret this time pushed York out because she feared for her children, and she also was very protective of Henry himself, despite his mental incompetency. And in this time, Warwick became York's closest ally, and he also had been named Captain of Calais by York already, meaning that he had many allies in Calais. And at this time, in 1457, due to a threat of a French attack, Margaret of Anjou paid Warwick to defend the English coast against the French. However, Warwick used this to his own advantage to enrich himself, and he attacked the Hanseatic and Castilian fleets before returning to England in 1459 to York. In 1459, Warwick then met with his father and York in Ludlow, England, and this led to a meeting with This led to a meeting with the king's forces. However, this battle was a loss to the Lancastrian forces because Warwick's forces, who were mercenaries and were from Calais, defected. York then fled to Ireland, and Warwick returned to Calais, obviously with his captaincy, and he frequently corresponded with York in Ireland to plan the next step. In 1460, Warwick decided to land at Sandwich, England, and then left his father. He and his father met, and he left his father, who was Duke of Salisbury still at this time, to siege London before meeting the king at Northampton on July 10th. Henry was captured, and other major Lancastrian dukes were killed at the time, including the Duke of Canterbury. And this is a picture of the Battle of Northampton. It was a very decisive battle, despite it being, at the time, war was not very bloody yet. Although this was the beginning of a very all-out war from accounts, and we will see further on in other battles that war became very bloody in this time period, especially the Civil War. The aftermath of Northampton led to York returning from Ireland, and he then declared himself King of England in front of Parliament, which we discussed in class was a failure, and it was completely just not accepted by Parliament at all. York disinherited Henry's son and Henry through the Act of Accord, and then at the Battle of Wakefield, York was killed, not Henry, that's a typo. Warwick was not there, and this was thought of as the reasons why it happened. Warwick met up with York's son Edward, but was defeated at the Second Battle of St. Albans. However, they decided immediately to march to London despite their defeat. And Warwick and Edward, unsurprisingly due to the Lancastrians being unpopular, were welcomed into London immediately. Warwick led troops at the Battle of Towton later after this, and Ferrybridge, two bloody battles which were complete Yorkist victories. However, Warwick was injured at these battles, and apparently at the second battle he barely participated. Edward was then crowned King of England and saw Warwick as his closest advisor, and also it seemed he saw him as a father figure at this time as well. Warwick was seen as a great battle commander and mastermind of military tactics of the time, and he was also seen as a very great political mind, as he had a way of knowing which side would succeed and what side to get on in the end. After this, Warwick gains power, and he had a vast network of retainers and inheritance from his parents' lands, and he also had an annual income of over £7,000 at the time, which is a ton of money. He was confirmed as captain of Calais, as well as High Admiral of England by Edward, and he also was allowed to appoint his brothers and other family members to positions of power within England as well. And another picture depicting Warwick as this very noble warrior protecting the Yorkist cause. However, this sunshine and rainbows didn't last. Edward, unbeknownst to Warwick, was married in secret to Elizabeth Woodville, while Warwick had been negotiating with the King of France to form a marriage alliance. And this offended Warwick due to the fact that Edward went behind his back as well as prevented an important alliance he saw with France. This led to the appointments of Woodville's family to positions in the government, and this led to Warwick becoming bitter as he saw them undeserving as marrying into the royal family, as well as the fact that he was losing power in general. The relationship between Warwick and Edward was not too strained yet, but Warwick decided after this to stay away from court because he disliked the Woodvilles. By 1467, though, Edward had become very unpopular, and Warwick sensed this like he usually did. Warwick's deputy in Calais had defected to the Lancastrians already, and by 1469 it was clear he had also defected, sensing the tide turning against his friend. And in shock to anyone, another rebellion occurs. Warwick planned to win over Edward's younger brother George. Warwick had George marry his daughter in 1469 in Calais to ensure his placing George's inner circle. Warwick won at the Battle of Edgecote, capturing the king and putting him in Middleham Castle in northern England. However, because the country was very unstable without Edward, even though he was very disliked. He released it. He had no choice but to release Edward. And in the end, a couple times, he set out a trap to catch Edward during this time. They failed. The second time, it did work, but Warwick eventually fled due to Edward getting out again, and he forced Edward off the throne. However, in 1471, Edward raised another army and Warwick was killed at the Battle of Barnet, a very bloody battle, and another Yorkist victory. And you can see back on this slide a picture of the battle. In the aftermath and legacy of the battle, Warwick's body was displayed at St. Paul's Cathedral in London to make an example of him. And also, Warwick had no heirs to his inheritance. His land and money was spread within Edward's family to enrich them. Warwick had a very impactful legacy, however. He was known as the Kingmaker in England and was willing to ally with anyone when he saw they would be on the right side of history or of power in general. In the end, he was seen as a very successful military commander as well as a political mind, and he is known as a very important figure in English history because of his impact. And here's my works cited.